She walked in with a limp and a cane, her rifle case older than half the recruits on the line. They laughed. They called her grandma, joked about bingo halls and knitting socks. But Margaret Kaine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or explain herself. She just unfolded her mat, lifted her rifle, and reminded an entire generation what true strength looks like. Not loud, not flashy, just steady. Every shot she fired rewrote their assumptions. Every step she took turned ridicule into reverence. This isn't just a story about a forgotten veteran. It's about the quiet power of dignity, the legacy of those who have walked through fire, and the strength it takes to be underestimated and never miss. The sun was a relentless tyrant at Fort Archer, scorching the desert gravel and turning the air into a shimmering haze by 0730. The firing range pulsed with the raw energy of anticipation, reeking of gun oil, sunscreen, and the sharp tang of nervous sweat that only a live fire test could summon. Rows of recruits stood near the firing line, their uniforms crisp, their grins cocky, their adrenaline still buzzing from morning drills. Some tossed jokes to shake off the tension, others fiddled with high-tech optics, pretending they'd mastered their gear. A few, when no one was looking, fumbled with straps and scopes, betraying their inexperience. To them, this was the crucible, the day to carve their names into the unyielding stone of Fort Archer's legacy, a place where dust never settled, and neither did pride. Then came the van, a faded military transport that groaned as it rolled to a stop, its suspension creaking like old bones. The door slid open with a dry rasp, and out stepped a woman who seemed to belong to another era. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if the desert heat couldn't touch her. A cane in one hand steadied her slight limp, not a sign of frailty, but a mark of battles long past, etched into her very stride. Over her shoulder hung a canvas rifle case, its olive fabric worn and weathered. Her khakis were plain, her windbreaker faded at the shoulders, and her cap bore no rank, only a stitched name, Kaine. Silver hair peeked from beneath the brim, and the sun illuminated every crease on her face, each line a story of time and grit. She was an anachronism, a figure who didn't fit the polished chaos of the range. The recruits noticed her immediately, and their reactions rippled through the line like a gust across the sand. "Yo, is that someone's grandma here to knit us scarves?" one called out, sparking a wave of laughter. Another nudged his buddy, smirking. "Bet she's looking for the bingo hall." A few mimicked her limp, exaggerated and mocking, while one recruit pretended to doze off, slumping dramatically. The jokes flew fast, some nervous, others cruel, but none quiet. To them, she was a curiosity, a misplaced relic in their world of cutting-edge gear and youthful bravado. They were here to prove themselves. She was, at best, a distraction. She didn't flinch. Her eyes, calm and measured, swept over them just once, like a hawk sizing up the horizon. "You think silence means weakness?" she said softly, her voice cutting through the wind's howl with a precision that made a few recruits pause. "But silence is how you aim." The words hung in the air, unhurried, deliberate, like the first crack of a distant storm. She kept moving toward the registration tent, her steps steady, her presence untouched by the heat or the jeers. The laughter faded slightly, not because they understood, but because something in her gaze made them wonder if they'd missed something vital. From the observation tower, Staff Sergeant Reynolds watched her through narrowed eyes. Her name had crossed his desk last week. Margaret E. Kaine, retired special authorization. But it hadn't raised any flags. Just another name in a sea of recruits and protocols. Now, though, as she walked past the snickering line of young sharpshooters, something in her posture caught him off guard. It wasn't pride or defiance. It was purpose, distilled and unyielding. She didn't acknowledge the recruits' taunts, didn't glance at the gleaming rifles lined up like trophies, didn't ask for a spotter or a partner. She just moved forward, a quiet force that Fort Archer, with all its noise and swagger, wasn't ready for. Something had entered the range that couldn't be measured in rank or years, a legacy wrapped in dust and silence. By the time Margaret reached the edge of the rifle range, the sun was a merciless furnace, baking the metal benches, and casting stark shadows under the awnings. Some recruits had sought shade, but most hovered near the gear station, adjusting slings, checking scopes, or posturing to hide their nerves. Up close, they got a better look at her. The rifle case slung across her back was older than any of them. Its canvas faded, its leather trim scuffed, its zippers kissed with rust. Her windbreaker looked like it had weathered decades. Her boots were soft with age, not a speck of tactical flash. No patches, no tech, just her cane and a presence that seemed to hum with quiet authority. "Is that even standard issue?" one recruit muttered, stifling a laugh. "Looks like it rolled out of a museum." Another whispered, "Bet she still calls the enemy a Krauts." A third chimed in, "What's next, musket balls?" The laughter spread again, quieter now but sharper, like a blade honed by confidence. Margaret ignored them. She moved to the end of the line, where the benches met the sand, and lowered herself to one knee with a grace that belied her age. She unfolded her shooting mat with the precision of a ritual performed 1,000 times. When she opened her rifle case, a few recruits gasped, then chuckled. The bolt-action rifle inside was pristine but ancient, its walnut stock weathered to a rich patina, a name, Kaine, faintly carved into the side. No bipod, no digital readout, just iron sights in raw discipline. "Seriously? That's her weapon?" A young corporal with mirrored sunglasses scoffed. "Might as well chuck rocks." A female recruit nearby muttered, "Someone's grandma thinks she's still got it." The mockery hung in the air, but Margaret didn't react. She settled at her position, her movements unhurried, her focus absolute. The wind howled across the range, kicking up dust that swirled like restless spirits. 5 moving targets emerged in the distance, their silhouettes dancing in the heat haze. One by one, the best recruits took their shots, their high-tech scopes glinting, their spotters calling adjustments. And one by one, they missed, curses and excuses filling the air. Then Margaret stepped forward. No scope, no partner, just her old rifle in hands that had seen more years than most of the recruits combined. She didn't blink. 5 shots rang out, each one a deliberate thunderclap. 5 hits, dead center. The range fell silent. Not a single word broke the stillness. The recruits' smirks vanished, replaced by something unspoken: shock, respect, maybe fear. Fort Archer, a place that roared with bravado, held its breath. Everything had changed in those 5 shots. Margaret Kaine didn't need to say a word. Her silence, her aim, had spoken louder than any boast. The dust still swirled, but now it carried her story, and the recruits knew they'd just witnessed something that would echo long after the sun burned out. Up in the observation post, Staff Sergeant Reynolds stood with his arms crossed, the glare reflecting off his sunglasses as he watched her. He didn't speak. His brow furrowed slightly, not out of annoyance, but something closer to confusion, or maybe curiosity. He had glanced through her file, or at least the parts he was allowed to see. But even on paper, Margaret Kaine didn't quite add up. She read like a shadow from an old war that people preferred to forget. There was something in her stillness, something in the way she didn't posture or perform. No edge, no ego, just an eerie calm, as if none of the noise around her even existed. When the pairing order came down, it was time for recruits to team up. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. The drill was basic: range finding, distance calculations, wind correction. Names were called in fast succession, recruits bunching into hasty pairs. But when they got to Kaine, the room seemed to stall. A subtle but unmistakable pause followed. No one moved. One recruit subtly stepped back. Another suddenly found the laces on his boot incredibly fascinating. The silence that settled was not a kind one. "She can just go solo," someone muttered, half under their breath. Reynolds didn't respond. He simply made a quiet note on his clipboard and shifted his gaze toward the far end of the range, where Margaret Kaine knelt by herself. She hadn't asked for a partner. She didn't so much as glance up. She just pulled a short pencil from her shirt pocket, opened a small, worn leather notebook, and began calculating her own wind and distance corrections by hand. While the whispers floated down the line, she waited, calm and unshaken, for the wind to change, for the noise to fade, for the shot that would eventually come. The first round was just a warm-up, static targets at 100 yards, barely a breeze to compensate for, a simple filter for big talkers who couldn't shoot. The recruits lined up side by side, rifles loaded and braced. Spotters knelt beside them, binoculars out, notebooks ready. Laughter still floated down the line like pollen, but the tone was different now, sharper, quieter. Margaret Kaine was the only one without a spotter. Still no one offered. No one dared. She was alone at the far edge, kneeling on a folded mat, the butt of an old rifle snug against her shoulder. Her face was unreadable. No nerves, no fidgeting. She adjusted her sights like she was tuning a radio. One breath in, one breath out. Focused. A few of the younger recruits stole glances in her direction, barely hiding their anticipation of a mistake. They wanted a failure. Something big, something loud, something they could snicker about later in the mess hall. "Watch this," one of them said with a crooked grin. "She's not even gonna hit the board." Then came the first shot. A sharp crack. Clean, deliberate, not rushed, not timid, just perfectly timed between gusts of wind. A spotter nearby, mid-chew on his gum, froze. Slowly he lowered his binoculars. "Dead center," he muttered, blinking. "Tight grouping." Heads began to turn, curious now. Margaret calmly cycled the bolt, caught the shell casing midair like it was second nature, and set it beside her. She fired again. Ping! Another center hit. She didn't make any big adjustments, just a barely there twitch of her scope. Another breath, another shot. Ping! Third hit. The murmurs started. One spotter nudged his partner. "You seeing this?" The casual chatter from before? Gone. Replaced with something colder. Uneasy, the kind of silence that creeps in when the story you've been telling yourself, the one about who's weak and who's strong, starts to fall apart. This wasn't beginner's luck. It wasn't chance. This was control. She wasn't gloating. She didn't look around to see if anyone had noticed. She didn't smile or smirk or even blink when the spotter finally called it out. 3 for 3, dead center, smallest spread of the round. Several recruits still held their rifles midair, frozen like statues. The noise, the jokes, the puffed-up commentary, all of it faded into a strange, unsettled quiet. Staff Sergeant Reynolds leaned forward slightly in his post, the corner of his mouth twitching. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown. Something else. Curiosity now sharpened into something closer to recognition. Respect? Not yet, but the silence said enough. They hadn't seen it coming. And suddenly Margaret Kaine wasn't just a background figure anymore. She was the focal point, the one they were all watching. The rifle she held wasn't just wood and steel. It was memory. It was years. It was wars they didn't understand. And when the break between rounds came, Margaret simply sat back, took a small cloth from her pocket, and began gently wiping the dust from the stock. Around her, the noise didn't exactly disappear. It softened. It faded. Not into silence this time, but into memory. Her mind went first to the Myeong Delta, the thick, wet air, the constant sweat that never dried, the echo of gunfire that always seemed to come from behind instead of ahead. Her first shot in combat hadn't been perfect. It hadn't been glorious, but it had saved a young private frozen in fear. 2 years later, he wrote to her, told her he'd named his son after her. She never wrote back. Then there was Kuwait, Desert Storm. It wasn't the bullets that haunted her from that time. It was the sand, endless, shifting, choking sand that seeped into everything. Your boots, your rifle, your mind. She remembered one morning firing 8 rounds through a cracked scope after her spotter went down. No tech, no support, just wind, instinct, and something else. Anger, maybe, or survival. When it was over, 7 lives were still breathing because of her. No one pinned a medal to her chest, no ceremony, just quiet nods from men too proud to speak. She looked at her hands now, the veins more pronounced, the skin thinner, marked with time, but the grip still steady. The grip, yes, that grip, remained firm, unwavering. These kids at Fort Archer didn't know who she was, and honestly, they didn't need to. Margaret Kaine hadn't come to impress them. She wasn't chasing after a shadow of her past or hoping for applause as some kind of send-off. She was there for one thing, to find out if the fire still burned in her chest. Not the fire for battle. God knew she'd had more than enough of that. But the fire for control, for razor-sharp focus, for that quiet, deadly composure that marks the line between a soldier and everyone else. This wasn't a battlefield, this dusty rifle range in the middle of the desert, but it was sacred all the same. Margaret Kaine wasn't standing on that range to be looked at. She was there to make sure that if she ever had to raise a weapon again for a reason that truly mattered, her hands would not tremble. Not once. Not ever. By the time the recruits made their way to the 800-yard line, the wind had turned cruel. It rolled in waves, sweeping up gritty veils of sand that stung the skin and turned the distant targets into hazy silhouettes. The instructors barked the same warnings they always did. Watch your crosswinds, adjust for drop. Don't rush. Everyone knew this stretch separated the talkers from the real shooters. Most of the kids were already worn down, sweaty, red-faced, agitated from the sun and strain. But none dared admit it. Not when the scores were being tallied. They went one by one, each laying down, each taking aim, each hoping to land something worth remembering. But the shots told a different story, miss after miss. Some rounds sliced wide, others clipped the outer edges. A few recruits managed to land near the torso marks, only to be met with sharp corrections from the spotters. High left drift. You're pulling. Adjust your stance. The tension grew with each mistake, simmering under the surface. Even Corporal Harrison, always cocky behind his mirrored sunglasses, had to fire 3 times before one finally struck near center mass. He rose afterward, scowling at the wind as if it had singled him out for punishment. And then, it was Margaret's turn. She walked to the mat slowly, no rush, no theatrics. The air changed. The laughter that had once buzzed around her had gone still. Some recruits crossed their arms. Others just stared. They were waiting. Waiting for her to fail, maybe, or to prove them wrong. Either way, she had their attention. Margaret quietly unrolled her faded shooting mat, settled herself into position with a grace that didn't demand notice, and pulled her battered bolt-action rifle snug against her shoulder. No spotter. She didn't need one. Instead, she listened. The wind shifted. She closed her eyes for a breath, letting the current slide across her cheek. She opened them again, flipped through her old weather-stained notebook, jotted a few adjustments, and set her sights. The first shot rang out. Crack. Ping. Direct hit. Second shot. Ping. Dead center. Third, fourth, fifth. Ping. 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 Each bullet landed with surgical precision. The grouping was so tight the spotter had to lean in and double-check the target. All targets hit, he called out. 2-inch spread. Cleanest grouping of the day. No one spoke. Not even Harrison. Staff Sergeant Reynolds lowered his sunglasses slowly, his brow furrowed, not just in surprise, but something deeper, something unsettled, like his understanding of the world had just been nudged off-center. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't look back. She stood up, brushed the dust from her knees, and walked away like she'd just wrapped up her morning coffee. But what she left behind wasn't silence. It was something heavier. The recruits uncrossed their arms, jaws tightened. The kind of hush that fell wasn't the end of something. It was the start of realization. For the first time, Margaret Kaine wasn't a joke. She wasn't even a question. She was the measure by which they'd be judged. And everyone there knew it. That night, as the wind finally died and the desert grew still, Staff Sergeant Reynolds sat alone in the admin office. The mess hall lights were already dimmed. The buzzing fluorescent bulb overhead flickered, casting shadows across his desk like a stuttering memory. He couldn't shake it. The spotter's voice replayed in his head. 5 for 5, tightest grouping yet. He'd heard impressive shooting before. Hell, he'd trained sharpshooters, champions. But what Margaret Kaine had done wasn't just technique. It was something older, deeper, like the muscle memory of a different life. Curiosity clawed at him. He pulled out the base's ancient personnel database, a system so outdated half the younger staff didn't even bother with it. He typed in, Kaine, Margaret E. The screen loaded slowly, blinking as though reluctant to reveal what it held. Then it appeared. Baum, First Sergeant U.S. Army, enlisted 1968, Vietnam War, 2 tours, later reactivated for Operation Desert Storm, decorated marksman, 6-time expert qualification, commendations for leadership under fire, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Then came the redactions, whole paragraphs blacked out, classified, lines struck through in vague government language. But one line stood untouched. Unofficial kill count, unconfirmed, assumed high. Known to have extracted a pinned unit under direct enemy fire in the Al-Jalib corridor, 1991. Reynolds blinked. He'd heard of that corridor, everyone had. A whole unit stranded, surrounded for hours, cut down one by one in open terrain. The legend spoke of a lone marksman who'd taken out 5 enemy combatants from nearly a kilometer away, turning the tide and saving the survivors. No one had ever confirmed who the shooter was. Apparently, they didn't need to. He scrolled further. No misconduct, no disciplinary actions. After retiring, she'd gone on to teach firearms safety to underprivileged youth in the inner city. And just like that, everything clicked. Margaret Kaine hadn't come to prove anything. She'd already done that a long time ago. She came to make sure that if the world ever needed her again, she'd still be ready. He had spent the whole day standing in silence, arms crossed, watching from the sidelines as others laughed and ridiculed her. He didn't say a word, not because he disagreed, but because, like them, he thought she was chasing phantoms. But as he leaned back now, exhaling hard, it hit him like a gut punch. She wasn't chasing ghosts. She was the ghost, the kind that built the very foundation beneath their feet. She had nothing left to prove, not to them, not to him. She'd done it decades ago, under fire, when it mattered. And now she was here again. Not for praise, though. Not for redemption. Just to remind herself that her hands still remembered what her heart never forgot. Reynolds printed the report, slid the paper into a manila folder, and rose from his seat slowly, the weight of realization still heavy in his chest. He didn't know exactly what he'd say to her, but he knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow he'd be the one listening. Night had barely settled over the barracks when the alarm shattered the stillness. A piercing siren, followed by a surge of panicked shouting. Boots slammed against the floor. Lights snapped on like gunfire. Chaos erupted. Recruits scrambled, half-dressed in gear. Instructors barked confused orders. Radios crackled, full of overlapping calls. Something had gone horribly wrong. Staff Sergeant Reynolds was already halfway out the door when he caught a few critical fragments over the comms. Live round, navigation drill, echo unit, 1 injured, 1 unaccounted for. It was supposed to be a simple nighttime land navigation drill. No ammo, just teamwork and coordinates. But somehow a real round had made its way in. One kid was bleeding, another was missing. Panic stirred under the surface of protocol. No one had clear instructions. Flashlights cut frantic lines through the desert night. Instructors shouted over one another, trying to gain control of the spiraling situation. And then she stepped into the mess. Margaret Kaine, already in her jacket, rifle slung over one shoulder, not as a weapon, but as an extension of herself. She didn't move with adrenaline, no rush, no panic, just focus. Pure, razor-sharp focus. Reynolds spotted her approaching the perimeter. "This isn't," he began, but she stopped him cold with just a look. Calm, steady, unapologetic. "You've got 6 rookies running in circles, one bleeding out and another still out there in terrain I know better than the back of my hand," she said, voice low but firm. "You want protocol or results?" He hesitated, only for a breath, then nodded. "Take point, I'll follow." She was already in motion. "The East Ravine," she said. "That's where he'll be." And she was right. Decades of war had etched maps into her bones. The terrain whispered to her like an old friend. She moved with certainty, reading boot prints, pausing at snapped brush, spotting subtle signs no one else saw. Her thigh throbbed with every step, an old injury from Kuwait, but she didn't falter. 30 minutes into the search, just past a dried creek bed, she heard it. A faint rustle, a soft groan. She dropped to one knee, eyes scanning the underbrush. "Colby?" she called gently. A low voice came back. Ma'am, you came back. He was tangled in bramble, arm twisted at a sickening angle, face pale and drawn. Of course I did, she whispered, crawling toward him. No one gets left behind. By the time Reynolds caught up, she'd already splinted the boy's arm with her own sling and was helping him to his feet with quiet reassurance. But Reynolds didn't look at the gear, not the first aid or the technique. He looked at her and saw something he hadn't before. Not an aging veteran, but a leader. Forged by fire, not decorated for it. I was wrong about you, he said softly. No, she replied, steadying Colby. You just hadn't heard the echoes yet. And in the dust-choked silence under the stars of Fort Archer, Reynolds understood. He'd follow Margaret Kaine into any fire. The final trial at Fort Archer was infamous. Whispers about it passed like ghost stories in the mess hall. 5 moving targets, 600 yards. Wicked crosswinds. Miss 2 and you fail. That was it. The instructors always said the same thing. This is where we separate the shooters from the statues. The targets glided across the range, mechanized silhouettes, jerking unpredictably, accelerating without warning. Some stalled mid-track. Others disappeared into the scrub only to reappear elsewhere like specters. Precision under pressure. That was the real test. Harrison adjusted his bipod, muttering numbers under his breath. His rifle gleamed under the rising sun, decked out with the high-tech optics, a laser rangefinder. Every bell and whistle the modern military could offer. He fired quickly, too quickly. He clipped 2, missed 3. 2 confirmed hits, provisional pass, the spotter called out. Harrison scoffed, shaking his head as if the tech had failed him, brushing dust from his knee. Then the name echoed across the field like thunder. Kaine on the line. Silence fell. Margaret Kaine stepped forward slowly, her old boots pressed into the dirt with the quiet authority of someone who remembered when this ground still meant something. She knelt beside her battered rifle, unfolding a worn shooting mat with the same reverence one might show a folded flag. No recalibration, no numbers whispered into the wind. Just memory, engraved deep into muscle and bone. She lay prone, cheek resting against the rifle's worn stock. The initials McCain faintly carved into the wood. The wind kicked up across the range, flinging sheets of sand through the air. The wind shifted sideways, kicking up dust and blurring vision for most. Everyone, except her. Margaret Kaine's eyes stayed steady through the scope. The first silhouette slid into view. Crack. Direct hit. Another breath. Crack. Second target. Down. Crack. Third. Confirmed. Fourth. Crack. Center mass. The 5th target darted left, then right, weaving in and out of cover as the wind surged. She didn't blink. Crack. Silence. The field went still. Final target neutralized. Every target down. No misses. Tightest grouping anyone had ever recorded on that range. No one moved. One. Not a breath. Even Harrison, always quick with a smug remark, stood motionless. His trademark smirk wiped clean from his face. Sergeant Reynolds didn't clap. He didn't need to. He stepped forward slowly, voice even, measured. That, he said, letting the silence breathe before continuing, is what excellence looks like. Quiet, precise, earned. Margaret rose, dusting off her knees like she'd done it 100 times before. No grand gesture, no smile, just a slight nod, directed not at the crowd, not at herself, but at the ghost she'd carried into that scorched desert field. Her silence roared louder than thunder, and across that shooting range, from the youngest recruit to the most seasoned instructor, every soul present understood. They hadn't just seen skill, they'd witnessed legacy, not etched in plaques or pinned on uniforms, but carved into the air by a rifle and a heartbeat that never flinched. The mess hall at Fort Archer usually throbbed with the everyday chaos. Boots scraping tile, metal trays clattering, the rattle of jokes tossed across tables like grenades. But that afternoon it was quiet, reverent, respectful. Margaret Kaine sat in her usual spot in the back corner, closest to the window where sunlight pooled on the wall. Same tray, same posture, back straight, elbows tucked in, eating with the solitary rhythm of someone who had done so alone for years. Only now the silence surrounding her wasn't isolation. It was honor. No one laughed. No one whispered about her limp or teased her age. No more jokes about knitting needles or bingo. Across the room, Harrison sat hunched over his coffee, eyes fixed on his untouched food, as if the tray might give him the answers he was still too ashamed to ask. He hadn't spoken since the test. Not to anyone. Not really. Then he stood. His boots echoed louder than usual as he crossed the room. Forks froze midair, heads turned. Even Reynolds, seated far off in the corner, leaned in slightly. Something was happening. Harrison stopped at her table. Margaret didn't look up. He cleared his throat, then again. "Sergeant Kaine," he said, voice low, unfamiliar. "I was wrong." She paused mid-bite. Slowly, she set her fork down. "About all of it," he added. His hands twitched nervously at his sides. "About you, I'll remember that shot for the rest of my life." Only then did she meet his gaze. A quiet nod. Small, tired, but real. It was everything. Harrison turned and walked away, swallowed by the heavy silence that still lingered like dust in the air. Moments later, two young recruits approached her table, Vega and Juno. Both had mocked her earlier that week, sneering behind her back, rolling their eyes when she limped past. Now they stood sheepish, heads down, trays in hand like schoolboys waiting for permission to speak. "Mind if we ask you something?" Juno said softly. "About the wind drift adjustment." Margaret looked at the empty seats across from her, then shifted her tray slightly, clearing space. They sat, not as equals, as students. For the next 20 minutes they asked not just about rifles, but about calm, about breath control, about how to know when to pull the trigger and when not to. She answered in fragments, short, clipped sentences, enough to teach, not enough to preach. When her tray was empty, Margaret stood. No words. She slung her rifle case over her shoulder and walked toward the exit. No applause, no parade, but every head turned. And long after she disappeared into the blinding heat outside Fort Archer, the silence she left behind remained. Not heavy, not haunting, but grounding, like the echo of something ancient and immovable that demanded to be remembered. Because from that day on, at Fort Archer, respect wasn't handed out with rank. It was earned in silence. True warriors don't shout, they don't boast or posture, they don't chase praise or drape themselves in accolades. They show up, they aim once, breathe slow, and let their work speak for them. Margaret Kaine never raised her voice. Not once, but the silence she left behind echoed through that base louder than any speech ever could. She arrived a stranger, dismissed before she had even touched a rifle, judged by the weight of her years, the limp in her gait, the quietness in her step. And yet, without demanding attention, without asking permission, she changed the entire rhythm of that place, not with confrontation, but with execution, with focus, with discipline honed not in classroom theory, but in combat, real, bloody, memory-stained combat, the kind that leaves shadows behind your eyes and aches in your bones no metal can soothe. She didn't gloat, didn't explain, she just did the work. Shot after shot, step after step. That's the kind of leadership the world forgets to celebrate. It's not loud, it's not glamorous. It doesn't wear filters or hashtags, but it endures. Because dignity doesn't beg for recognition. Legacy doesn't crave a spotlight. And real warriors, they lead even when no one's watching, especially when no one is. By the time her days at Fort Archer came to an end, Margaret Kaine had done more than just earn her qualifications. She had done more than pass a series of trials. She had reignited a quiet truth that many had forgotten, one that doesn't wear medals or raise its voice. She showed a new wave of soldiers that skill doesn't come with an expiration date, and strength doesn't always arrive with thunder and fanfare. She left behind more than just spent shells and targets riddled with tight clusters. She carved out a path, silent, steady, unshakable, for others to walk. Some say a new recruit is arriving next month. A young woman, likely nervous, unsure, searching for her footing in a place designed to push her to the edge, just like Margaret once was. But maybe this time when she lugs her gear through those gates, things will be a little different. Maybe the whispers won't come so quickly. Maybe someone will remember the older woman who carried a weathered rifle case like it was an old friend, who walked with a slow, deliberate gait and never wasted breath on proving herself, because her aim did the talking. Maybe someone will hesitate, reconsider their assumptions, and listen before laughing. Because when silence comes from someone who's lived through fire and come out tempered, it's not a void, it's a signal, a sign of hard-earned wisdom. And wisdom, like legacy, doesn't announce itself with fireworks or speeches. It stays put, patient and firm, offering guidance to those willing to look beyond noise and pride. It becomes a compass for anyone seeking direction. It reminds us to breathe, to aim with more than just our hands. Margaret Kaine's journey was never just about a shooting range. It wasn't just about uniforms or forgotten veterans. Her story is a mirror held up to the world we live in now, a world that rushes, that judges at a glance, that values volume over depth. How often have we dismissed the quiet ones? The ones who show up early, leave late, and don't ask for attention. How many times have we passed by the older woman with the cane, the man who barely speaks, the worker who never complains but keeps the place running? We move so fast we rarely stop to see them. But they're there, holding the line, holding us together. Margaret's story reaches beyond military walls. It's a reminder of respect, not just for our veterans, but for the people in our families, our neighborhoods, our lives. The ones who never seek credit, but carry the weight anyway. So maybe it's worth asking, who's the Margaret Kaine in your world? Who's the person quietly carrying burdens, offering strength while everyone else rushes past? Have you thanked them? Have you really seen them? If this story struck something in you, I'd love to hear about it. Tell us about someone who reminds you of Margaret, or a moment when you were quietly underestimated, but let your actions speak louder than any defense. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And if Margaret's quiet strength touched you, consider passing her story on. Like a ripple in still water, you never know how far it will reach or who needs to hear it today, especially someone who might be feeling unseen. Because silence isn't weakness, it's where wisdom waits.